Welcome to Hauser Wirth. I'm Russell Salmon, Associate Director of Events here at the Gallery, and we're so thrilled to have you here today for this public lecture on preserving the starting space with artist Charles Gaines. One of the most important conceptual artists working today, and a pivotal figure in the field of conceptual art, Charles Gaines's body of work engages formulas and systems that interrogate relationships between the objective and the subjective realms. Using a generative approach to create series of works in a variety of mediums, he has built a bridge between the early conceptual artists of the 1960s and 70s and subsequent generations of artists pushing the limits of conceptualism today. Stemming from his decades-long artistic practice and influential teaching career, we'll hear today from Charles about the nature of how systems and chance relate to the political discourse and the abstraction of objects, responding directly to the works on view in Charles Gaines' Southern Trees, as well as his monumental kinetic sculpture on Governor's Island, Moving Chains. All of this underscoring how he has continued to forge new and unexplored paths within an innovative conceptual framework. Moving Chains, which will reopen to the public in the spring, is part of Charles Gaines' The American Manifest, a series of monumentally scaled works presented by Creative Time with Governor's Island Arts and Times Square Arts that contend with ongoing legacies of colonialism and slavery in the United States of America. We are also very happy to welcome Creative Time here today, who are selling fabulous Charles Gaines-themed editions by artists Lauren Halsey and Edgar Arsenault to raise money for the Charles Gaines Fellowship at CalArts, which supports Black MFA students, as well as raising funds for Creative Time. And now with that, please join me in welcoming Charles Gaines for his lecture on preserving the starting space.
Thank you, Russell, for that modest introduction. And I'm glad that the t-shirts are here. I was thinking about putting on one myself. Oh, gosh. But it would be delightful if you bought one because the proceeds go to a good cause. So what I'm going to do is, as Russell suggested in his intro, I wanted to take the opportunity to talk about the mechanics of how the political domain operates in my work, how the work undertakes a political critique, since on the surface it seems to be more of a formal practice than a, let's say, critical practice, even in the case of the, what I call the language works, like Moving Chains, where it seems like a political critique is right in front, but is really what's being overlooked often, which is often overlooked, is the formal properties, and in fact how the formal and the critical properties work together. And both the series, I thought I'd take the opportunity to write some comments on that. So, and at the same time, we're going to show some slides, so you don't have to look at me. And the slides are actually just the pecan trees that we photographed in Charleston. So we just put together a slideshow of some of those actual trees, and it'll be rotating, so it goes back and forth. And the pecan is an interesting tree in relation to Charleston because it is connected with the history of the Civil War and slavery. Because the pecan trees were brought to South Carolina in general after the Civil War, because since the South couldn't utilize slavery anymore, cotton became too expensive to produce, and they went to instead to the pecans. And So there are just hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pecan trees in the south. A lot of them, and in Charleston in particular, and a lot of them were destroyed in a couple of the storms that have come through the area in the last few years. Probably, I think, something like 60, 70% of the trees were destroyed in those storms. But the ones remaining, if you find that rather than looking like they're existing in an orchard, that they have these considerable spaces in between them, which was good for us because it allowed us to shoot them, to photograph them. But I thought that there would be, so these slides will be going on while I'm talking, and at a certain point, when I begin to talk about moving chains, we'll show you a short video of moving chains. So I'll give you the high sign when we get to that, okay? Okay, so I'll read to you what I wrote. So my work employs two types of systems. One system is mathematically based. With this system, I produce the photographs. I produce from photographs a gridded image of things like trees and other plants, and sometimes faces and sometimes figures and bodies. This translation from analog to gridded image allows me to employ the image in a system that methodically aggregates objects or things of the same type. Simply put, this is a translation of the object to a formal language, where the symbols of that language replicate patterns that both resemble and signifies the object. The other body of work employs the language system. In this body of work, I bring together two or more things that are unrelated in order to provoke associations between them that make their relationship meaningful. As these associations are drawn, a sense that their relationship is arbitrary is sustained so that the audience understands that these associations and meanings are drawn from their own understanding and not from the subjectivity of the artist. More about this body of work later. But I want to underscore that in both bodies of work, the main critique that I'm interested in is this critique of subjectivity, and that it is not, it doesn't challenge it as an idea. What I intend to do is challenge it as a fundamental property in the making of works of art. And I intend to show that exists as a kind of binary that separates our feelings and emotions from our intellect, so that scientific enterprises operate in our intellect and art operates in the feelings. But my feeling is that the art also operates in the intellect, not divorced. It doesn't separate from the feelings. There's a breakdown of the binary. So that same critique is central to both bodies of work. So returning to the mathematical systems work, or as I call them, the grid works, the shape of objects, such as trees, which I commonly use, is plotted on a grid with numbers. This gives the numbers an instrumental function as they visualize the trees, and at the same time, the system that's used to serialize them. We can see how that plays out in this exhibition. I start out by taking photographs of trees, selecting from them a certain number that will make up the work, then sequencing these photographs. I next assign a color to each tree and also to the numbers that plot their shape. I then translate the analog image to a gridded image of the tree by filling in the squares of the grid with the numbers that plot their shape and fill each of these squares with color. The process is actually reversed as the numbers are handwritten or painted over the painted squares of the grid. The series is realized as I progressively overlay one by one each gridded tree, starting with a single image of the first tree and ending with a composite image of all the selected trees. The position of each grid box or triptych in the series tells you how many trees are overlaid. Number 1 is an image of one gridded tree, and number 5 is, in the series, is made up of 5 trees. Number 8 then is a composite of 8 trees. I'd like to describe this process as one where the system is, quote unquote, painting the tree, rather than some combination of my skill and imagination. The system realizes the work as physical objects, works of art to be experienced not only aesthetically, but also as conceptual propositions. The critique is embedded in the inseparable relationship between its aesthetic and conceptual properties. That is, the numbers and grids constitute both. The systemic tropes determine the formal play that visualizes the object. In works of art whose forms come from the imagination, what am I saying? In works of art whose forms come from the imagination presupposes a subjectivity that is responsible for it. As a result, in this work, the forms or figures are presumed to originate in the imagination. The work then functions as an index to the imagination, making the work's most important purpose to be giving access to the imagination of the artist. The result is that both individualizes and universalizes the work, protecting the subjectivity of the artist from critical challenges and separating it from culture. And so, yeah, so this goes back to what I was talking about before, that this is where I'm interested. My general critique, the interest of my general critique lies here. And I want to make clear that I'm not making an argument that the imagination or subjectivity are bad concepts, or even that they're not legitimate concepts. I'm not making such an argument. In fact, some of my best friends have imaginations. You know? But my critique is focused about the use of those concepts in determining how works of art made. And I simply am trying to make the case that by focusing it on the imagination, the artwork is secured in a personal space of the subject. And that subject is so personal that it is not accessible culturally. In other words, what you experience personally is an individualizing experience that other people can't access because it's just your own. You know, I mean, like looking at a color. Nobody else can look at the color like you look at a color because that's your own experience. And but you can tell people you're looking at colors. But then when you look at a color and have that experience, nobody can say that whatever you're seeing is wrong, because it can't be wrong. It's your own experience. All right, so this personalization of the subject then protects it from social and critical critique, social and political critique. So in my work, those tropes of subjectivity are redefined as properties of a system, where the origin of the trope does not reside in the imagination of the artist, but is instead instrumentally produced in the self-referentiality and circularity of the system. This may seem like another formalism that simply advances another universalist construct that is protected from the vicissitudes of culture, but in fact, since the system is engaging objects like trees, it is not in fact closed. It is dealing with representation. It's through representation that it creates a social and cultural communication. In this way, it is participating in a critique of culture and not purely self-referential. It is here that the work functions propositionally and discursively as it invites a conversation about the problems with the modernist idea of art, which is based on the universality of subjective expression and the proposition that the single purpose of a work of art is to provide for it, to provide that access, I should say. It also presupposes that art as a discipline based in aesthetic judgment and must be protected from instrumental ideas that come from cultures such as political ideas and analytical constructs. The reason the system invites discourse is that its engagement with the tree, in its engagement with the tree, certain paradoxes are produced with respect to the relationship between abstraction and representation. The grid works undermine the binary relationship between formal abstraction and representation because both are present when normally they cancel each other out in the same moment. If we consider that a window may have a square shape, art treats the square as the formal language that underlies the window as an object. They are mutually exclusive in the same moment because you always only see the window, and the square only exists as a proposition, an idea about it, but is actually invisible. But when we consider how the grid works, in representing a tree, the grid forms a general geometry of space that makes the formal translation of any object into a gridded form apply only to that object. So the translation of the tree to a gridded form doesn't displace the recognition of the tree. It is an abstraction that isn't totalizing because the tree is still present. And in this instance, the tree, as a representation, is always tied to culture. This simulates what happens in perception as the brain recognizes objects by the relational patterns that make them identifiable. In this case, the translation into a formal language reveals a basic paradox between the abstract and the real, which is the failure to recognize a mutual space where they coexist. Such a space is necessary to establish their codependence. This is also necessary for any idea to be a legitimate expression of what we know to be reality. For example, if the square is a legitimate idea that defines in part a window, how do we come to know it? Especially when we realize we can only generally know the point that locates where one thing ends and another thing begins. That is to say, we can try to empirically determine the relationship between a mathematical idea of the window as a square by measuring it, laying a grid over the object. But ultimately, the point where one thing ends and another begins is immeasurable in absolute terms. I should give this other example of that because before it spirals into some kind of haiku poetry. But in my class, I give Zeno's paradox, that example where Zeno, the mathematician, gives a mathematical problem to his students. And what he asks the students is that in the story, the Achilles in the Peloponnesian Wars is in battle, and at a certain point, he finds himself in danger and he starts to run away. Of course, the mythical figure is, can't be killed except if he is struck in the ankle. And so an enemy sees him running and tries to shoot him with a bow and arrow. So the arrow leaves the bow and follows an arc until it reaches his tendon and strikes him, and he dies. So the mathematical problem is, at what point in space between the point the arrow is shot and this point where it strikes Achilles, where is the point where the arrow actually strikes him? So, which means then that the arc has to be subdivided into moments or a grid, points. And presumably one of these points would be the one that had killed Achilles. But the system, the mathematics that illustrates the problem this way is a failed one because at any point, or I'll put it this way, that any point along that arc can be subdivided and make new points. And so you get into this situation of infinite spaces between 2 points, where you never know, you can't create the point that is the transition to his death, because such a point literally in this model doesn't exist. But in reality, of course, he dies. So the paradox, the problem was trying to solve the paradox, but what I am interested in is demonstrating that the importance of that infinite space that can't be subdivided to turn into one point that takes you from one thing to another. The space between two things is always diffused. It's Fred Moulton calls it the blur, but it is not given to the logical perception of objects moving through space. And this is the reality that I'm trying to suggest here, that there's no way, as I said, that is to say we can try to empirically determine the relationship between a mathematical idea of the window as a square by measuring it, laying a grid over it, over the object. But ultimately, the point where one thing ends and another begins is immeasurable in absolute terms. So herein lies the paradox. As in the example with the window and the rectangle, in this case, we see either the window or the rectangle. But as we said, with the grid system allows us to see the rectangle and the window at the same time. This is a paradox because we presuppose that the abstract and the real exist in a binary relationship, and that they cannot conceptually be unified. So the gridded image is like the point where Achilles dies. Almost. That is to say that the gridded image has the function because it creates a diffuse space where you can entertain two things that normally can't be entertained at the same time. The square and the window can't be seen at the same time, but a plotted tree on a grid shows both the formal language and the tree at the same time. That thing that accesses the world at the same time as its means of expression, which is a kind of structure. In art, we speak of this binary as abstraction versus representation and attempt to mediate their opposition mechanically by establishing a formal language to representation, or emphasizing the geometry that is at the basis of any representation or a representation of an object. In art, the laws of representation define the square as the formal language or a measure of the object window. But similar to the attempt to empirically mediate the difference in the world in order to affirm the universal nature of that language, there remains a blur at the point of separation rather than a distinct point. But the paradox here is that in the grid system that I use to plot the shape of objects onto it, both the object and its formal language are coexisting. This is not the same as looking at a tennis ball and seeing a sphere, because in that instance, you're always looking at a tennis ball. It's always present. In the case of the gridded image of the tree is not present, only the geometric system. Only through resemblance, we are able to link it to the object. The system I employ here leaves gaps that allows chance to play a role. My larger role for systems is to allow chance to leave its marks as part of the execution process. This happens because there is a considerable space, a gap produced by the paradox. So what I'm claiming here about the grid is that you're looking at the tree and its formal language at the same time, which is otherwise impossible if you think of the reality and representation as or let's say abstraction representation is existing in a binary system. But when you think you think you're looking at the tree, you're actually looking at the system. But it still looks like a tree. And the fact that it looks like a tree allows you to enter the real world or the regular world. I mean, that's how critique can get into the world from some kind of wacko system. Now, this brings me to my second body of work, the language-based projects. As I mentioned earlier, in this project, I bring two or more unrelated things in proximity in order to provoke an interpretive or associational process to find meaning between them. And one of these, one work that exemplifies this is the large-scale sculpture that is presently on Governor's Island, titled Moving Chains. I think this is a good time to look at the video. So moving chains is a 120-foot long structure that is 17 feet high and 15 feet wide across its floor. It is made of two distinct parts. The bottom is a structure that could resemble a boat or a barge. At the top is a structure that holds 9 large chains that stretch lengthwise over the overall piece, resting on idlers and looping around motors that move the chains at speeds that are identical to the speed of rivers and river currents. 8 chains move at the speed, while the 9th chain moves at the speed of a typical 19th century vessel, boat or barge, that traverses the river. 2 unrelated elements for me were these. As I said, that it was, I always put 2 things that are not related together. In this case, the structure, which is the bottom of the object, the part that resembled a boat or a barge, and the other part are the chains at the top. I brought them together as an assemblage. My expectation was that the audience would find a meaning through association that could unify or link them, that these meanings would come from their cultural experiences and learned histories, that they could identify any objects. In her article on moving chains, Hannah Black quoted me saying these things, that the chains and the structure are 2 entirely separate, unrelated things. But we can bring them together using a metaphor to create a political narrative, or using metonymy to describe how they are existing in the world, a literal description of their social and cultural use, or describe a context where they are in the world as related. The history of slavery is one context, and the history of commerce is another. She comments, as I admit to him in our conversation via Zoom, I am confused by this. And a moving chain, or a moving set of chains, is technically arbitrary. What is arbitrary about the relationship between slavery and commerce? Their histories are so imbricated over the past few hundred years that they have been at times one and the same. And doesn't the non-arbitrary nature of the relationship between slavery and commerce mean that Gaines's choice to combine a barge with chains is just as conditioned by cultural learning as my response to the work? So I wrote her to say that we actually agree. The relationship between slavery and commerce is not arbitrary. It is well established. It is a well-established narrative. But for me, the arbitrary relationship is not there. It is between chains and the boat-like structure. When I was coming up with this idea, I saw a site full of things and artifacts in a now-defunct port in St. Louis on the edge of the Mississippi River. Among the things there, I saw mooring chains and I saw boats. But I did not come to the site with a predefined narrative that connected them. I was treating both chains and boats not as objects, but as metonyms, which essentially is that they're not dealing with the object, but what the object means. I say to her that she seemed to misunderstand that I start with the names of things and not with things themselves, and with the myriad of potential histories that they may reflect on narratives that they may produce. The names of the objects as literal signs are unrelated as metonyms, or as individual objects at the beginning of the process. The metonyms become metaphorical through our associations, or form descriptive narratives that come from our cultural learning. One way of thinking about this is that, going back to the grid as an example, that the individual squares of the grid, even as they sit side by side, are first seen as individual squares. And then we begin to see a pattern that links them. So I'm making the point that these are 2 different processes that we all undergo in determining the meaning of things. And I try to create something that resembles that process when I make works of art, And that also maps out the work of art as an experience, so that you sort of understand that the meanings that you are seeing are part of your cultural learning and not mine. And the meanings that I see are part of my cultural learnings too. Right? This discussion with Mrs. Black left me with the impression that I may need to bring into public domain the relationship of systems and logical processes on the one hand and cultural learning on the other. Clarifying this might explain why in some of my work I employ the political subject. In the case of moving chains, the object begins as an abstraction, an assemblage built upon a linguistic framework. I use the language system in defining the objects as metonyms. This allows them to become unattached to any specific narrative and then attached later through association. My view is that throughout all of this, the object remains an abstraction. The fact that it remains an abstraction, I think, proves my point, that these objects are, for all of us, different. If the machine becomes a representation of something in the world, then it's not an abstraction. But as the associations are formed, the abstraction remains, and that is that of an assemblage. The object, it's always an assemblage, and remains an assemblage even as you attach meanings to them. The fact that you attaching those meanings does not undermine it as an assemblage or an abstraction. It's an assemblage and abstraction. I'm using some as this meaning the same thing. It reminds us that the meanings are not produced by my intention, but produced on a quite different plane, which I call the discursive. The politics of the work is not just revealed in any conclusion we might make about commerce, slavery, and history, or not that alone, but also by the system or structure that we use to make these conclusions. I'm referring now to that blur, that space, that diffuse space that we can't identify where one thing ends and another things begin. I think that politics happens in that space. My idea about how political discourse works is that in the case of the grid work, not only is the aesthetic experience ultimately informed by our social and cultural knowledge, based in the idea that our ideas and concepts are attached to objects and experiences culturally, the political dimension operates discursively, and this discourse plays out in the indeterminate space between the real and the abstract. It plays out there by blurring the distinction. The sentence wasn't over. It plays out there by blurring the distinction between concepts and reality. It happens within the realm of representation as the gridded image of the tree constitute both the object and its formal language within the same moment. The analog tree is seen as existing on the sliding scale from illusion to reality, from the real to the abstract, from representation to abstraction, rather than a binary that makes these poles oppositional and discrete. In this case, discourse as an aspect of the social is always present in the aesthetic domain. With respect to the language works, the system that I use is the linguistic system, where I place two or more things that are unrelated together in such a way to promote the audience to interpret through a relationship through associations. The differences are linked by metaphor and metonymy, the linguistic tropes we use in language to form meaning. The same blur that exists in the grid boxes between abstraction and representation are formed in the language works in the space between the unrelated things. Both literal and poetic meanings are formed, associations that are not a product of the imagination of the artist, but realized in the discursive space of the audience. The artist is in this process as the member of the audience. The end. And, I think we've decided a few minutes for any questions, Russell?
Hello.
Yeah, just speak into the mic if you can.
Sure. Professor, you used the phrase cultural learning several times. Would that include historic learning?
No, absolutely. I mean, the whole realm or context of learning of any sort, I'm just generally calling cultural learning. All right? And within that space is where I'm saying that the political domain exists. And typically, in modernism has made the argument that that space is not one that is important to works of art. You know, that the art is trying to isolate a personal space and not amplify a cultural space. And amplifying this personal space it makes it convenient for people to say that any instrumental idea, like a political idea, is separate from the idea of a work of art. So I'm trying to argue against that with this general notion of cultural space.
Thank you.
You mentioned linkage. Can you tell for us if there is a similarity between the linkage of the chains and the linkage of the tree branches and what it means?
Yeah, that sounds like my next piece, actually. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point because, you know, in some of the works I use blow-ups, what I call exploded images of the tree, and they're close-ups. So you see a fragment of the tree, not the whole tree. And so that's, in that way, it's similar because it's trying to deconstruct the entire space or the perceptual space of the tree. It's trying to, you know, isolate a certain section. It's just another way of creating a difference between, in the work on the fifth floor, the graded images are of the whole tree, and you see in the photograph just a section of that whole tree, and that's another example of fragmentation, you know, or creating difference.
Can you tell us what philosophy, what role philosophy plays in your work? Is there Kant and philosophies of perception and so on?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I was influenced by those theorists who were suspicious of you know, the history of European philosophical thought. And, but I mean, since I'm an artist, not a philosopher, I call them philosophers too. But they don't call themselves philosophers because they are busy trying to dismantle philosophy, you know, because they have suspicions about certain universalizing practices that's at the heart of philosophy. But I don't have any trouble saying that's a kind of philosophy. Because I think that I have a natural interest in philosophy, and it's got me in trouble. But you know, philosophical thought is something that is just part of my temperament, or at least my interest in philosophical thought has been part of my temperament. And when I was teaching, you know, it dominated a large part of my teaching, and this is. It's strange because it made me kind of weird to my students because nobody else did that. I mean, because everybody else has had this, you know, problem that if you do too much thinking, you're going to become a lousy artist, which probably happened anyway. But in any case, you know, the thing that gave me a license was, you know, that very thing, part of the very thing that I was criticizing, and that, you know, as an individual, there's no reason why I can't play out this interest in as much and as far as I want to. Only if you're not denying, you know, others to have different interests.
Hi. So
I know this guy.
I'm curious about this question of like the domain of the personal and the abstraction, and how you sort of manage it through the choice of subject, but oftentimes those are also deployed in, in so many artworks, the subjectivity is discussed in terms of, say, mark making. Like, we see subjectivity through the signature on the work, how the brushstroke is made. In your work, you seem to have, you've taken tactics within its production materially to sort of maybe play within that. Could you talk about that more?
Absolutely. In a certain way that you can imagine everything that I do in a work could be done mechanically. And it's always been important that they're not. I used to even hand draw the grids, but we stopped doing that. That was ridiculous. The reflection on the hand or the mark is more for me a product or a marker of chance than it is subjectivity, and I wanted to keep that kind of dynamic going on because I think it adds to this indeterminate space that I wanted to foreground. So the hand done or the gesture. I was just saying that gesture is important to me. I just give it a different name.
Charles, would you tell us about the sound for the video we just saw, and more generally, how you use systems to create composition for music?
Well, yeah, I'm glad you reminded me to do that. In the first part of the video, there was a musical composition. So that comes from a series of works, from the language-based work that I called manifestos, where I take a document, usually a political document, and change or translate the letters on that document to musical notes. So the letters A through G, wherever they fall in the document, they're translated and on a sheet of music as notes A through G. And I also translate H as B flat. And that comes from the fact that this whole system of translating letters to notes I didn't invent. It's been something that's going on, and as far back as medieval European music, but really championed in Baroque music. But the thing that I like about that, rather than giving it a divine reason as they did in early music, my interest is more to reflect on ideas of indeterminacy, like John Cage and so forth. So that composition comes from a translation of the text of the Dred Scott case. That particular one is part of the Taney decision, and manifestos, that text is scrolled in front of you while the music is played. What I said about earlier about creating a space of difference and allowing the audience to try to close that space operates in manifestos too. In addition, I should say, because what people. The system means that the melodic lines themselves are produced by chance, and the chords are produced by chance and not by design. But in order to make the arrangement, I listen to the raw music that's produced by the translation, and I listen for melodies, and I expand on those melodies in the arrangement for an ensemble. I don't see this the same as creating melodies from my imagination, because it is realized in the same way that, for example, the assemblage works like in moving chains, and that is that you are creating from material that's given to you. In this case, the material comes from the system. And so I see that kind of decision different. And I gave this example the other day that that rather than you know, when I look at a note like a B flat, I can decide on what pitch, or is it a high B flat or a low B flat, and that it comes as part of my decision. But I don't see that as a design decision coming from my imagination, simply because I make a decision. Because I compare that kind of decision to the kinds of decisions you make playing chess. When in the chess game, you have choices, but those choices nobody thinks is expressionistic moments, you know. But you have choices, and it is at the same time you know that even though that the possibility of moves are almost infinite in chess. I mean, there's more than you can sort of comprehend. You know this operating within a very rigorous system that is responsible for the limits, the things that limit you in playing chess. So I think making works of art and making art decisions is precisely the same thing. It's you know, the so-called rules. The cultural and social space creates limits within which you operate. And you have the idea that the possibilities are limitless. With modernism, modernism makes you feel that freedom is only because of your subjectivity. And my view is that the appearance of freedom is a creation, or is produced by the cultural space that you live in. Is that good enough?
Maybe one more question, if there is one.
Thank you. Charles, you've been talking about, from your earliest days, you talked about systems when you showed in the numeral show at Castelli, which in a way removes the artist, allows it to be chance, and without the subjectivity of the artist. But in your selection of some of the elements of the trees now, are you saying that those are not subjective, that those are random somehow? How do you reconcile the subjectivity?
Which part are you talking about? What part are you
well,
asking about randomness?
when you take fragments, for example, of the trees, are you not making a selection? Is that
yeah, I mean, that was what I was addressing in that prior answer, that decision or selection or decisions like those are given to you and operating within a sort of a set of rules. And just like whatever I choose, or whatever we come up with in photographing a section of the tree, that's operating within a set of conditions that are prescribed culturally and socially, and not from my imagination. So that kind of decision is different from the modernist idea that, you know, you have this site, this place within you, from which you're allowed a total freedom for your imagination, because it's operating. That space your intellect isn't operating in that space, and so I'm saying that that's.
So you're saying that there's nothing subjective in your work?
No, I didn't say that either.
Well, it appears that you are, if you're saying that there are rules that determine it.
No, the idea of subjectivity, I'm a total advocate of. In fact, you know, I created the system, right? I'm a total advocate of that, right? But what I'm saying is that what modernism calls subjectivity, which the existence of a kind of internal force that's invisible, but as you said, is responsible for gestures. That's what I'm disagreeing with. That art doesn't come from this undefined and invisible space of the subject that's inside you, which is absent intellect, right? That the art comes from a mediated space which involves both your intellect and your feelings.
Thanks.
It's a place to stop. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, everyone.